Well, good morning, Lighthouse Church. My name is Josh, and I am the lead pastor here at Lighthouse. We are so glad that you're here to worship with us. If you did not know, we are one church family in two homes, Lighthouse Lakewood, Lighthouse Denver, and I am so excited to be with you guys as we continue in our series in the Gospel of John. We are in John chapter 6 today, John chapter 6 starting in verse 16, and we're talking all about this idea of how, what is our response, or how are we supposed to respond to the storm? When we find ourselves in life in a storm-like scenario, what's our response? How do we experience that? How do we deal with that? How do we work through it? And so John chapter 6 is where we're going to be at. We're also going to be in Jonah chapter 1, Old Testament book of Jonah. And so make sure you grab your Bibles, flip on over there. And you can kind of do, whether digital Bible, paper Bible, whatever, but New Testament, Old Testament, John chapter 6, Jonah chapter 1 is where we'll be at. Talking all about this idea of how to respond to the storm. How do you respond to the storms of life, the storms of faith, and the importance of who gets invited in to that experience, that story. So in 2015, my wife and I were in San Diego. We were in San Diego for a retreat and a little time away, spending some good time with some friends. We were also there for some stuff for the church. And so we're hanging out in San Diego. And if you don't know anything about San Diego is beautiful. San Diego has just chill weather. It's it's like an oceanic city. It's just absolutely fantastic. Great food, great everything. And so we're there. We're loving life. But a part of our itinerary for the entire week was we were going to go from San Diego, and we needed to go meet some friends up in Fresno. And Fresno is not a coastal city. Fresno is not particularly amazing. Fresno is Fresno. It's just kind of like in the middle of nowhere, kind of like Pueblo for Colorado. It's just kind of, it's there. It's not bad, but it's not great, kind of a thing. So we're in San Diego, and we got to go to Fresno. And instead of driving to Fresno, which would have been about a 7-hour drive, we decided to fly. It was a part of our kind of plan. And so we get on this plane. We get to the San Diego airport, and it turns out that the plane that goes from San Diego to Fresno is like a part of this super tiny aviation company that owns propeller planes still. They have planes that sit like 30 people, 60 people. They have propellers on them. And I didn't know that this existed. Also, by the way, just a little heads up, I'm terrified of flying. I don't like flying. The thought of flying freaks me out. I got to do all these weird things with my hands and my breathing, to make sure I'm not anxious while I'm flying. It's crazy. And so we get to the airport, and there's clouds everywhere. It looks kind of pretty freaky, and they're saying that they might get some rain, and it's just not good. And so we get there, and there's this propeller plane, and I'm sitting there thinking, man, I didn't know that we were flying back in the Wright brothers world of propeller planes. I didn't even know those existed anymore. So we get on this plane, and I'm freaking out. I can't handle this. I have no idea how to live in peace on a plane that has propellers. I think that's crazy. So we start going, and right off the bat, the pilot gets up on and he goes, hey, by the way, we just did this flight from Fresno back to San Diego. We're going back home. Just want to let you know it's going to be a really bumpy ride because we're going to be going through a storm. And this plane doesn't have the ability, because of the propellers, to get high enough above the storm to they got to go through the storm, right? And me with my high anxiety, fear, all this stuff. So we're in San Diego. I was loving San Diego, going to Fresno. So we go, right? And we're on the plane, and it's an hour-long flight because this plane goes 27 miles an hour. And it's bumpy, and it's going, and we're getting thrashed around. And literally, I'm calling the flight attendant, and the flight attendants are walking. They're like, sir, can I help you? And I'm like, are we going to be able to get out? It's this, I'm terrified. We're freaked out. It's not good. The drops, the 10-foot drops that make you gasp. And they weren't even giving out drinks. They weren't doing Coca-Cola or waters because they were afraid that people's drinks would get thrown. It was just a horrible, horrible, horrible storm, horrible experience. We finally get to Fresno. I mean, when we land, like I get off the plane, and it's such a small plane, mind you. We get off the tarmac, and we literally have to walk down steps like we're in an emergency exit like scenario. We have to walk on the tarmac. Like that's how tiny this plane was. And man, I get on the ground, I'm like kissing the ground. I'm like, oh, thank you, Jesus. We got out of the plane and we got through the storm. And so the next day, I'm watching the news early in the morning, and I hear the newscasters talking about the storm. And they're talking about this big, rainstorm that came through California. And the way that they were describing the storm was so unbelievably positive. They were like, man, this was one of those storms that we've been waiting for. This is one of those storms that we've needed for the last 9 months. And I was just like, wait, what are they talking about the storm that almost like killed me? Like, what are we talking about? And then they say, man, like this storm brought so much rain to the Central Valley all the way down to San Diego that it replenished most of the reservoirs, and it kept this horrific drought from just dominating the state of California. That all these people were celebrating this storm, and it was a storm that I absolutely hated, and yet but it was this thing. They were like, wow, the storm was so good. Like the storm was so, like we needed this. Our agriculture needed it. Like our little states needed this storm. And I was just so shocked because in one way, the storm was terrifying for me, and yet another way, the storm was redemptive for so many other people, millions of other peoples. And friends, I think it's really interesting that sometimes the very same storm, the very same tumultuous experience that many of us may have can actually be experienced in two completely different ways. That the same chaos, the same disruption, the same worry, the same difficulty, the same storm, whatever you want to call it, that on one side of the clouds, it can be worrisome, and then on another side of the clouds, it can be encouraging. It can give you faith. Like I think it's just a beautiful word picture of what storms can actually bring. And the reality is that storms, more often than not, especially in the scriptures and in the Bible, the question really comes up is not so much that if storms will show up, but really the question is that what do you do in response to the storm? Do you freak out? Do you celebrate? All of these things. But there's a point to the storms. And today in our story, today in our passage, we're going to jump into two different stories. So we're going to jump into a story in the Gospel of John about a storm. And then we're going to jump into a story in the book of Jonah about a storm as well. And we're going to see that there are a lot of similarities to almost every single storm. And yet, we're also going to see that there are differences, and then there is a very important response that is necessary when you experience storms, because the storms will actually come. And so what's the response? Is the response fear, trepidation, anger, frustration, or joy that there's actually water falling from the sky to the ground to a hungry world? What is our response? We're going to look at these two storms. So let's begin reading. John chapter 6. Verse 16, short little section in the Gospel of John, and we'll check out this first storm, the first wave of potential despair. Look at this, verse 16. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake. So John is in the middle of a story of telling us about when Jesus feeds the 5,000. So last week, Pastor Brett and Pastor Brienne, they preached on Jesus feeding the 5,000. After he feeds the 5,000, they try to make him a king by force. Jesus ends up going into the wilderness area to go and pray. We actually have this is a story that happens in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. All four of the Gospels tell this story. And the way that they tell this story is a pretty all-encompassing narrative. Jesus makes an intentional decision to leave a whole bunch of people who are becoming exceptionally needy. They demand from him, they want to take from him, they want to pull from him. He's not ready for them to make him who they want to make him into. And so he leaves, he goes to this wilderness area. In other gospels, Jesus actually tells the disciples deliberately, he says, I need you to get into the boat because it's late, and I need you to go to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And so he doesn't say that in this gospel, but he says that in all the other gospels, the exact same story. And so evening comes, all of these 5,000 people are kind of waiting, like, where's Jesus? Jesus leaves. The disciples then get down into a boat and they go onto the lake. They go into the Sea of Galilee, and their goal is that they get into this boat and they want to go across the lake for Capernaum. So they're told, get into the lake. Get into the boat, you need to go away. Jesus is basically saying, I need you to leave. Trust me that you're gonna be fine, and I need you to go. Now, what's not said in this passage, which, by the way, he says, but by now it was dark and Jesus had not yet joined them. That's a little clue. By now it was dark. Yeah, you really shouldn't be going out in the middle of the night on the Sea of Galilee. It's just historically known for being a volatile place. Like, it's just known for having bad weather. I mean, if you ever get a chance to fly into Denver, you know, and you're flying from the West Coast and you fly in and you go over the Rocky Mountains, I mean, it's guaranteed turbulence, right? And for someone who struggles with flight anxiety, like, I have to prep myself. Like 30 minutes before we land, I gotta buckle up and I gotta get ready to die. Like, I'm just like, here we go. Like, we're going down. And I always have this weird picture in my brain that, like, we're always gonna hit Pikes Peak. Like, for some reason, I always think we're gonna be on the south side of the state and we're gonna just run right into Pikes Peak. And it's like my overriding fear every day of my life, like, that I fly. It's crazy. So the Sea of Galilee is known for having bad weather. And what we know of in other gospels is that this is not the first time that all of the disciples were in a boat together. There's a story that happens not in the Gospel of John, but it's in Matthew and Mark, where Jesus is in the boat with the disciples. They're on the Sea of Galilee, and when they're in the boat, the whole thing is about to be destroyed. They're gonna die. They're screaming to Jesus, Jesus, help, Jesus, fix the problem. Don't you care about us? Jesus is sleeping. He wakes up, he gets to the front of the boat, he calms the storms, declares his victory or his claim over all of creation. And so there's a subtle narrative going on here where Jesus is almost testing the faith of his own disciples again. He's like, hey, the last time that you got in a boat, when I told you to get into a boat, a big storm came up and I had to prove to you how incredible I was. Well, now I'm gonna tell you to get in the boat again. That life with Jesus is about getting in the same boats that cause the same anxiety and the same feeling of worry. And he's like, yo, when are you gonna trust that I've got this situation handled? Like, he's not gonna remove you from the circumstance over and over and over again, hoping that maybe you just go a different path. But often he asks you to go through the same circumstance to learn a different message and to trust him more. And many of us, man, we just love to think that Jesus is all about taking us out of a difficult situation and recreating a brand new situation. And Jesus is not in the business of doing that. He's in the business of telling you to get back on the sea that you're terrified of, to go through the storm that you're worried about. And so he tells me, you got to get in the boat. And so they get in the lake and then they start heading across the sea. They go for Capernaum, but Jesus is not with them, okay? A strong wind was blowing and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, which now, guys, 3 or 4 miles is hours, right? This is a very long time to be rowing in a rowboat to try to get to the other side of the sea. And so they're in this crazy scenario where wind is blowing, waters are growing rough. We know from the other gospel accounts that the disciples are once again absolutely terrified. I could imagine Andrew or John going, gosh, dang it, guys. Like, the last time Jesus told us to get into a boat, this exact thing happened. Like, we're freaked out. But this time around, Jesus isn't in the boat. Jesus isn't here to stop the storms. And so what are we supposed to do? The normative emotional experience is likely happening with these disciples. They don't like this. They're freaked out. The wind is blowing against them. The waters are growing rough. Like, this is not good. And so when they had rowed for hours and hours, 3 to 4 miles, I mean, they're maybe rowing a mile an hour. Maybe. So they're 4 hours in. It's dark. It's 11, 12 p.m. at night. It's horrible. Well, while all this chaos is happening, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. Now, look, if we could just acknowledge the oddity of this, right? One, Jesus should not be walking on water. That's freaky, okay? That it's even if you think about it theologically, like wow, Jesus is claiming authority over the waters, that he's greater than even the parting of the Red Sea, that he doesn't part the seas, he walks on the seas, and you're like, oh, divinity and power and miraculous authority. You're like, that's all cool and dandy until you see Jesus walk on water. The moment you see Jesus walk on water is the moment that you start getting freaked out, that the storm doesn't really seem to be as scary as a dude whose buoyancy, he's more buoyant than water. Like, this is weird. And the last time they saw Jesus, he was walking up into the wilderness, man. So how on earth is Jesus supposed to see sailors lost at sea in the middle of a storm? Like, their brains are getting all sorts of blown up. And so they see Jesus approaching the boat in the middle of the night. So that means that, like, it's horror scene central, right? Like, it's dark. There's no lights. They're not, like, no one has flashlights that they're like going around. And so basically, how are you seeing Jesus approaching your boat? Well, it's a storm, right, Lighthouse? Right? It's a storm, and it's a storm that has tons of wind, and waters are going absolutely berserk. And so the other gospels hint at this, like, it's a big thunderstorm. Raining, chaos. It's me flying from San Diego to Fresno. It's like you can't get through it. You can't see through it. And so how on earth are you seeing Jesus, this silhouetted figure, approach the boat? And how are you not absolutely, why are they so terrified? Well, it's because, man, every single time there's a shot of lightning, they just see this like figure walking on the water. Just boom, lightning and thunder, right? And then all of a sudden, Jesus shows up for like a second. And then it's it. And then they're like, wait a second, did you see what I just saw? And everybody's like, wait, what are you talking about? And no one's wondering, ooh, is Jesus is he pulling the water trick again? Like, no, their brains aren't there. And so, like, it's like every third second they're seeing this figure show up and get closer and get closer. It's like the movie, what's that movie in the late 90s where the chick walks out of like the television and she's like, man, like she's freaked. And then she walks out of the television and then she like jolts at the character. And it's like this classic, you watch the movie and you end up dying, like that whole movie. And it's like that, that's what it's, and so their response is that they're frightened. Totally makes sense. I mean, like, I'm afraid of flying, okay? But if I saw Jesus outside of the plane, just flapping his wings, just like, what's up, dude? And like smiling, like thumbing me up, like, this is great. And he's out my window, I'd poop my pants. Like, I would be like, there's no fear of flying that would overcome my absolute sheer fear of a man breaking cosmic laws. And so they see Jesus and they're frightened. The storm is overwhelming. Jesus is walking up, like, this is insane. And he said to them, it is I. Don't be afraid. It is I. Now that word, it is I, is ego eimi in the Greek. It's the exact same phrase in the Greek Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, for when God tells Moses, I am who I am. Jesus is claiming divinity in this moment. He's saying, I am who I am. Do not be afraid. It's the greatest, it's the most often commanded statement in the entire Bible. Don't be afraid. Don't be worried about this storm. Don't be nervous about the rain. Don't be anxious about the dynamics of your situation. He says, don't be afraid. He's not just saying, don't be afraid about me. He's saying, just don't be afraid. He's like, don't be afraid that I'm walking on water. Don't be afraid of the water. Don't be afraid of what's happening in this world. And then verse 21, the simple story ends. Then they were willing to take him into the boat. They're like, whoa, okay. Well, Jesus, you're willing to take us you're willing to be here. You're here. We believe in you. We'll let you in the boat. And then it says this amazing thing. And immediately, the boat reached the shore where they were heading. So the first story of a storm that we look at is one that's like, it's magnificent, and yet it's also like crazy. And you could feel it, right? Like you could feel the disciples getting into the boat worried. You can feel them you can feel the anxiety that would be stirring up in them, because the last time they were in a boat on the sea without Jesus, things just didn't go well. Like you can feel that emotion. It's the same story, the same rehashing, the same experience over it. And so you get in it, and then you can feel the nervousness of the storm and the terrifying reality that they may die. And then there's the weird aspect of Jesus. And yet when Jesus shows up, he says, I am who I am. Do not be afraid, because I am God. And because of this incredible revelation of who God is through Jesus Christ, they then invite him in. They say, man, come on in. And there's an immediate sense of restoration, that the storm ceases because the invitation takes place. It's a beautiful story. But we have to compare this now with another story, another storm that's in the Old Testament in the book of Jonah. I want you to check this out. If you don't know this story, this will be new to you. If you are familiar with this story, I want you to get rid of any VeggieTales version of Jonah that you may have in your brain, okay? Jonah is not awesome. He is not a great missionary. Jonah is actually a bad dude, and his response to God is very unique, yet his story is very similar to how John tells the story of the disciples. Look at this, verse 1. The word of the Lord, Yahweh, God, came to Jonah, son of Amittai. So God is speaking to Jonah in many of the same ways that Jesus spoke to his disciples. And he tells them, I want you to go to the great city of Nineveh. Nineveh was not a Jewish city, so this is a pagan city. And he says, I want you to go and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. I want you to leave, and I want you to go to this place called Nineveh. So there's a command, very similar to the commands that Jesus gives the disciples for them to go across the lake. God is telling Jonah, you need to go. But instead of listening, Jonah ran away from the Lord, and he headed to Tarshish. He ran away. The Hebrew actually says that he went down to the city of Tarshish. Going down is very symbolic in the book of Jonah. And so he doesn't listen to God. Instead of, it's unlike the disciples listen to Jesus, Jonah does not listen to God. And so instead of going to Nineveh, he actually begins to head to another city called Tarshish, which is more towards the coast. He went down to Joppe, which would have been right at the edge of the Mediterranean, where he found a ship that was bound for that port. And so he wanted to get to Joppe, and so he gets to this, and he finds a boat, and he gets into this boat because it's going to go. After paying the fare, he went aboard, and he sailed for Tarshish. And the reason why he's doing this, the reason why he's getting in the boat, the reason why he's getting in the river or in the sea, is because he's trying to flee from the Lord. So his motivation is totally different. Then the Lord, while he's in a boat, sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. The storm was so aggressive, it threatened to destroy all who were in it, including the ship itself. All the sailors were afraid. Excuse me. And each cried out to his own God, because this was a very diverse group. This was not Jewish people in this. This was all over, people from all over the world, sailors from all over the world. They're crying out to their own God. And they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he laid down and he fell into a deep sleep. It's almost as if Jesus in his ministry tries to redeem almost everything that Jonah fails to do. This man, in the midst of an incredible situation of despair, doesn't give a rip God tells him to do something. He says, I'm not going to listen to you, God. I'm going to go to the sea because I want to go to the sea. I'm going to go down into the middle of this boat. I'm going to go as low as I can possibly go to get away from you, God. And so he just goes down because he doesn't really care. And he goes into a deep sleep. The captain went to him and he said, how can you sleep? Get up, call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us and that we will not perish. Maybe we've been calling out to our God. Our God has not been saving us. Maybe your God will. Then the sailors said to each other, come, let us cast lots to find out who is responsible for this calamity. Let's basically like roll the dice. And if it lands on somebody, then maybe it's their faults. And so they rolled the dice, and sovereignly and providentially, God uses this goofy magic trick to show the sailors. He uses something so incredibly secular to point out that Jonah is unfaithful. Like, guys, it's getting called out for being unholy by your friends that are Christians in Lighthouse Church is one thing. Getting called out for being unholy by people who live a whole unholy life is totally like, it just breaks you. Like if you've ever had a friend who didn't love Jesus and yet they called you out for not looking like Jesus, that's when your heart just melts, right? Like when your friend looks at you and says, aren't you supposed to be different because you're a Christian? Like that's what's happening here. The lots fall on Jonah. So they asked him, tell us, who is responsible for making all this trouble for us? Why are we in this ridiculous storm? What kind of work do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? From what people are you? Yo, why are we about to die? Is what these guys are saying. And he answered them, I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord. I worship Yahweh, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. He basically just told them, I worship the God who controls all that's happening. I worship the God that basically is making this occur. He's like, it's kind of my fault. I'm the one who did this. This terrified the sailors, and they asked, well, what have you done? Like, what is wrong with you? And they knew that he was running away from the Lord because he had already told them. He told them that his God was a little pissy, and so they ran away. That's basically what he said. And they're like, wait a second. You mean to tell me that the God who created the seas, you decided to upset? You decided to perturb the God who sustains the earth? Like, oh my gosh. The sea was getting rougher and rougher, and so they asked him, what should we do to you to make the sea calm down for us? Pick me up and throw me into the sea, and it will become calm. I know that it is my fault that this great storm has come upon you. Now, do not believe that Jonah is trying to be all sacrificial here, okay? Jonah is being suicidal. He doesn't want to do what God has asked him to do, which is to go to Nineveh. And so he's saying, throw me over. And it's not like a sacrifice. He's more or less just saying, end my life. I don't want to do this. This storm is horrible. I might as well give up on life. Get it over with. You'll be good. I'll be good. God will be appeased because blah, 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 blah. If I just end my life, God will be happy. So he's not being sacrificial in a Jesus-like way. He's being selfishly sacrificial. He's being selfish in his desire. Just get it over with. I don't even care anymore. Pick me up and throw me into the sea and it will become calm. And I know it's my fault that the great storm has come upon you. But instead, the men did their best to row back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. Then they cried out to the Lord, please, Yahweh, Lord, do not let us die for taking this man's life. They're like, man, we don't want to throw this guy over, but I guess we will. Don't hold us accountable for killing an innocent man for you, Lord. You have done as you pleased. Then they took Jonah, they threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. And at this the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. Now the Lord provided, now here's the deal, before we make the assumption that Jonah was doing this sacrificially beautiful thing, God still had a plan. God still had a desire for Jonah, which was go to Nineveh and do what is right. And he was going to do anything possible to make sure that Jonah did what he was supposed to do. And so because of that, he does basically one of the most goofy, comic booky, ironic, strange, mythological things that you could possibly imagine. And he sends a huge fish, is what the text says. Now the Lord provided a jumbo fish, a sushi grade ahi tuna fish, a big old thing, and it swallowed Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. It's how the chapter ends. Now, later on, we know that Jonah is actually puked up. Literally, the text says he is spewed out. He's vomited off. And he happens to just easily be vomited onto the shores of Nineveh. But nonetheless, you've got this weird dynamic going on here of this story. The depths that Jonah would go to not obey God, and ends up finding himself in a storm. Now, again, here I want to say this, guys. If you were to look at both of these stories at face value, like if you weren't trying to dig, right? So if we didn't dig the way that I did, if you just read them, there's a lot of similarities, okay? There's a ton of them. You could parallel, you could put these into 2 different little tables, and then you could connect the dots. Starts off with the commands of God, and not just John's account, but all of the gospel accounts talk about Jesus commanding the disciples to get in the boat, to go to Capernaum. Capernaum was a lost place that needed the love of Jesus, and God tells Jonah, you got to go. So there's a connection of going. There's a connection of God commanding the main characters. Everybody gets in a boat. Whether the intention or not is the same is not relevant. What we're saying is a top-down, just kind of superficial reading of the text. God commands them, and then they do it. The main characters all get into a boat. When they're in the boat, a storm arises. It's a bad storm. And in both accounts, actually in Mark's account, which is fascinating, the Gospel of Mark, he almost uses a verbatim language found not only in Psalm 107 and Psalm 77, but also in the book of Jonah. There's Mark very clearly uses language that seems very similar to the book of Jonah to parallel, that these are similar situations. So the storm arises, and eventually there's an aspect of deliverance. The people are delivered, they're puked out onto the shore, or they're brought to the shore, but the similarities, they're there. We're supposed to see these similarities. And when you read the Bible, guys, you're supposed to see similar stories, similar contexts, and see how they line up, how they mesh up. But here's the thing. The differences between the two of them are astonishing. The differences of response, the differences of experiences are astonishing, because if you think about it, there's so many similarities in this storm. You're like, wait a second, storms this, storms that, people this, people this. It seems so complementary. But if you see the differences, the difference between Jonah and John, the most amazing one is that the difference, it's actually not the storm. Like I want you to hear this, guys. The difference between the story of Jonah and the story of the disciples is not whether a storm exists or not. Did you guys notice that? We've been talking about the storm, so I hope that this is like totally makes sense to you. But like the issue isn't, well, one of them was faithful and one of them wasn't, and so that's why there wasn't a storm or there is a storm. That's actually not you can't dissect that. What's amazing about this entire scenario is that you've got a whole group of disciples that are incredibly faithful, and then you've got an incredibly unfaithful Jonah, and yet their stories are the same. They get into a boat. One's trying to be faithful, group's trying to be faithful, one's guy's not being faithful, and yet the situation is the same. The storm comes. The boat begins to rock. The fear is like the storm is still real. And I need you guys to hear me as I say this before we get to the real pieces of application here. It doesn't matter, guys. I need you to hear me as I say this, Lighthouse Church. It doesn't matter if you resonate with the disciples or you resonate with Jonah. It doesn't matter if the bank account is full, the bank account is empty. You're holy, this person's unholy. The world is this way, you're not this way. It doesn't matter who you are, what you've experienced in life, how your relationship with Jesus looks. It doesn't matter how great you think you are or how great you are not. The reality of the world that we live in is that storms absolutely happen. It's amazing that that's actually not the one difference between these two stories. The storm is real. Issues are real. Brokenness is real. The problem isn't, the difference isn't the storm. So don't go living life assuming that if you're faithful like the disciples, you won't get into storms. And if you're unfaithful like John, you will get storms. That's not how it works. Storms come. But here's the difference. It's not the storm. The difference is why the storm happens to begin with. And not just why the storm happens, but the response of the storm. Why the storm happens? Well, that's a whole nother ballgame. And the two reasons, or we could see it clear as day. There's two distinct reasons the storm happens. One is clearly because of disobedience, and one storm is clearly because of obedience. Like the storm is real, but the reason behind the storm is totally different. One, disobedience, and one, obedience. I mean, think back to Jonah's scenario again. Think back to the tempest and the brokenness and the storm rising up. Why does the storm happen? Think about it. Because Jonah is radically disobedient. Because God has a plan and Jonah doesn't like that plan. Because God wants to do something in Jonah's life. Like there's a whole purpose to this. And Jonah doesn't want it. And so the reason why Jonah, the storm just begins to destroy him and destroy his life is because he is purely disobedient. And some of you guys, man, you're living life and you're in a storm because of disobedience. Because of decisions that you have made. You're living, like, guys, you act like we do this all the time. You get so mad at God that storms exist, and yet you don't ever introspectively wonder what you've done to cause that storm. Could be your own sins. Could be your own decision to live life the way that you want to live. It could be your own sexual stuff, your own addiction stuff, your own pride, your own anger, the way you treat people. Like, guys, storms happen, and oftentimes storms happen because of disobedience. Many of you don't want to admit that. I'm not Jonah, I'm not Jonah, I'm not Jonah. It's like, well, the reality is that you actually are Jonah. God tells you one thing, you say, I'd prefer to have another option, please. And he goes, fine, you can have a storm. And then you're like, oh my gosh, how come you haven't gave me a storm? Just throw me off, God, I'm done. And he's like, what, no, I'm gonna have you then eaten by a fish because that's embarrassing as heck. And then I'm gonna have you puked up on the ground because I got something to do in your life and you better get up and do something about it and follow me. Storms can come because of disobedience. We don't want to admit this. We don't like this. You don't like it that I'm telling you this right now because you're going, no, God's too gracious. He would never send a storm. He loves me so much. No, buckle up, homies. The storm you are living in is likely because of your disobedience. But then there's the other piece, the other side to the coin, the other perspective of the storm, the San Diego enjoying the rain while I'm freaking out in the plane, right? Well, there's the other side of it, which is sometimes the storm exists because of obedience. I mean, if you looked at the text, again, the storm is stirred up against the disciples because they faithfully listened to Jesus' instructions. Jesus says, get in the boat. He says, you got to go over to cross the sea. You got to go to Capernaum. And Jesus leaves them alone. And the storm exists because they were being obedient. So wait a second. You mean to tell me, Josh, that a storm can exist because of my disobedience? Yes, absolutely. And you likely know it too. Jonah knew it. He just didn't want to admit it, and he thought it was all God's fault, which is this self-cyclical, it's individualism. Jonah just basically personifies American Christianity. That can happen. But then, Josh, but you're also telling me that the storm can exist because of my obedience? The storm can exist to push me, to test me, to challenge me, to help me gain more faith in God. Yeah, absolutely. The storm can exist for one of two different reasons, obedience or disobedience. Which if you think about it means, guys, and this is what's so encouraging about this whole passage, it means that the problem isn't the storm. It means, like, hear me, the issue at hand, all of us want to read the Gospel of John and think, oh, the issue is the storm. Oh, and the Jonah, the issue is the storm. Oh, my money is the issue. My family is the issue. My parenting is the issue. Like, and the thing is that, like, we look at these storms and we think that they're bad. But if they're predicated on obedience and disobedience, it actually means that they're not bad or good. They're actually just a tool. Like, no one would say a screwdriver is bad. No one would say a hammer is bad. No one would say a nail is bad. Why? Because they're tools. They're used. They have a purpose to them. And so, is a storm bad? I don't know if you could say that. Is a marriage on the brink of divorce actually bad? Or is God using that as a tool to bring about some sort of beautiful forgiveness and redemption? Is a broken system bad? A storm that looks just absolutely corrupt bad? Or can God, or is God choosing to use it? Or does God send it to use it? Notice, both of these storms are sent by God. Both of these storms are under the sovereign power of God. We go, I don't like to think about that, but you have to think about it. So that means that storms, they are the workings of God to prune us, to shape us. It means that these storms are sometimes used as a way to prove God's faithfulness, God's love, God's grace. Storms aren't the problem, guys. Storms are not the problem. The problem, once again, we get back to the original statement I made in the beginning of my sermon. The problem is not the storm. The problem is not the scenario of the storm. The problem is not the plane. It's not the rainfall. It's even not the obedience or the disobedience. The real issue at hand here is, what do you do? And I need to ask you this. What do you do? What is your response when the storm actually comes? How do you respond to the storm? And that's what this passage, and that's what John and Jonah both provoke in you and me. If the storm isn't bad, and the storm exists because of obedience and disobedience, and the storm is often used to prune or provide and show us the goodness and character and mercy of God, and everything that we could be going through could actually be used in a specific way, one way or the other, to do something impactful, then the real question actually is, what is the overall response? Jonah's response: despair, jumping off, being eaten by a fish, failing miserably. He wants to respond in the worst way possible, which is, I am going to absolutely give up. And some of you, that's what you want to do. Some of you, that's why you're here today. You think I'm done. I'm going to give up. I'm over it. The storm's too much. I can't handle it. I cannot do it anymore. I'm out. But then there's the other response. And the other response that we see in the Gospel of John is the one that's actually so much more beautiful, which is why it's such an incredible story. The disciples are freaking out. The disciples do think that their life is going to end. The disciples do wonder, why did this storm happen? The disciples are questioning whether Jesus cares about them or not. And yet the response is that Jesus starts walking towards them, calling them, beckoning them, just like God already called Jonah and beckoned him. And he starts walking up to them. And even in their fear, when they finally see that Jesus is I am, he is the God who creates, he is the God who sustains, he is the God who goes to the cross, he is the God who rises from that cross, he is the God who delivers, the God who redeems, that when they hear I am who I am, do not be afraid, their response, totally different than Jonah's. Their response is they invite Jesus into the boat. And the moment that they invite Jesus into the boat, which is very clearly just this beautiful symbolic statement of invite Jesus into the storm, invite Jesus into the bank account, invite Jesus in to the marriage, invite Jesus in to the school, invite Jesus in to your job, invite Jesus into your depression, invite Jesus in to your addiction, invite him in even though you're afraid to let him in because what he seems to be offering seems almost impossible. Invite him in. The moment that he is invited into the boat, John says that they are immediately brought to shore. So what are we actually looking at here? We're looking at a story that pulls out in us this weird and strange question. And it's not, do you want a storm or not? It's not how to avoid the storm, but it's, are you going to invite God into the storm? Are you going to seek reprieve from God in the middle of the storm? Are you going to let God take you to the shore? Or are you going to make God puke you out on the shore? That's the response. And when you look at Jesus in this story, friends, you need to hear me. When you look at Jesus in this story and you see his invitation, you see his pursuit, you see his passion for his disciples, Jesus wants you to invite him into the storm. He wants you to invite him into the boat. He wants you to invite him into the entirety of your life. It's the whole point of the gospel. He died for your sins so you could be invited in. You can literally invite him into all of who you are, so he could just dispel out all of who you used to be. And so it's like this beautiful question of, well, what are you going to do? How are you going to respond? The storm is real, so will you with fear say yes? Or with fear say, just throw me off. Throw me overboard, I'm done. I pray today, friends, that you do not just say, just throw me overboard, I'm done. Don't be done today. Invite Jesus in and let him be your response to your storm. Let me pray. Jesus, we know that you hold the world in your hands. We know that you control every thunderclap, every boom of lightning. We know that you control the things we think are uncontrollable. And yet we really, really, really need your help to see you walk on the water, to invite you into the boat. We're terrified, man. Some of us are just so stinking nervous to let you in. And maybe we thought we did once before, and we thought that you failed us. And Jesus, please forgive us for thinking you failed. Man, maybe that storm it needed to work itself out more in our lives. Maybe that storm was not yet done, and yet we were impatient with your work. Maybe we wanted the immediate take us to the shore, but maybe there was a journey along the way with Jesus you wanted us to go on. I don't know what it is, but today, Jesus, we want to surrender to you. Today, we want to respond to you. Today, we do not want to be Jonah. We want to be the disciples, and we want to say, Jesus, come on into the boat. Welcome into my storm. Please calm it for me. We love you. We need you. Would you please enter into our storm? We pray these things in your name. Amen.